Chapter 11. Conclusion of Part First. There are many other legends recorded in the Old Testament which might be treated at length, but, as we have considered the principal and most important, and as we have so much to examine in Part Second, which treats of the New Testament, we shall take but a passing glance at a few others. In Genesis 12 is to be found the story of Pharaoh's two dreams, which is to the effect that Pharaoh dreamed that he stood by a river, and saw come up out of it 7 fat kine, and 7 lean kine, which devoured the fat ones. He then dreamed that he saw 7 good ears of corn, on one stalk, spring up out of the ground. This was followed by 7 poor ears, which sprang up after them, and devoured the good ears. Pharaoh, upon awaking from his sleep, and recalling the dreams which he dreamed, was greatly troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Finally, his chief butler tells him of one Joseph, who was skilled in interpreting dreams, and Pharaoh orders him to be brought before his presence. He then repeats his dreams to Joseph, who immediately interprets them to the great satisfaction of the king. A very similar story is related in the Buddhist Fo Penjiang, one of their sacred books, which has been translated by Professor Samuel Beale, which, in substance, is as follows. Suddhodana Ija dreamed 7 different dreams in one night, when, awaking from his sleep, and recalling the visions he had seen, was greatly troubled, so that the very hair on his body stood erect, and his limbs trembled. He forthwith summoned to his side, within his palace, all the great ministers of his council, and exhorted them in these words: Most honorable sirs, be it known to you that during the present night I have seen in my dreams strange and potent visions. There were 7 distinct dreams, which I will now recite. I pray you, honorable sirs, let not these dreams escape your memories, but in the morning, when I am seated in my palace, and surrounded by my attendants, let them be brought to my mind. At morning light, the king, seated in the midst of his attendants, issued his commands to all the Brahmins, interpreters of dreams, within his kingdom, in these terms: All ye men of wisdom, explain for me by interpretation the meaning of the dreams I have dreamed in my sleep. Then all the wise Brahmins, interpreters of dreams, began to consider, each one in his own heart, what the meaning of these visions could be, till at last they addressed the king, and said, Maharaja, be it known to you that we never before have heard such dreams as these, and we cannot interpret their meaning. On hearing this, Suddhodana was very troubled in his heart, and exceeding distressed. He thought within himself, who is there that can satisfy these doubts of mine? Finally a holy one, called Tsoping, being present in the inner palace, and perceiving the sorrow and distress of the king, assumed the appearance of a Brahmin, and under this form he stood at the gate of the king's palace, and cried out, saying, I am able fully to interpret the dreams of Suddhodanakaya, and with certainty to satisfy all the doubts. The king ordered him to be brought before his presence, and then related to him his dreams. Upon hearing them, Tsoping immediately interpreted them, to the great satisfaction of the king. In the 2nd chapter of Exodus we read of Moses thrown into the Nile, which is done by command of the king. There are many counterparts to this in ancient mythology. Among them may be mentioned that of the infant Perseus, who was, by command of the king, shut up in a chest, and cast into the sea. He was found by one Dictys, who took great care of the child, and, as Pharaoh's daughter did with the child Moses, educated him. The infant Bacchus was confined in a chest, Ly order of Cadmus, king of Thebes, and thrown into the Nile. One he, like Moses, had 2 mothers, one by nature, the other by adoption. He was also, like Moses, represented horned. Osiris was also confined in a chest, and thrown into the river Nile. When Osiris was shut into the coffer, and cast into the river, he floated to Phoenicia, and was there received under the name of Adonis. Isis, wandered in quest of him, came to Byblos, and seated herself by a fountain in silence and tears. She was then taken by the servants of the royal palace, and made to attend on the young prince of the land. In like manner, Demeter, after Hades had ravished her daughter, went in pursuit, reached Eleusis, seated herself by a well, conversed with the daughters of the queen, and became nurse to her son. So likewise, when Moses was put into the ark made of bulrushes, and cast into the Nile, he was found by the daughters of Pharaoh, and his own mother became his nurse. This is simply another version of the same myth. In the 2nd chapter of the 2nd book of Kings, we read of Elijah ascending to heaven. There are many counterparts to this in heathen mythology. Hindu sacred writings relate many such stories, how some of their holy ones were taken up alive into heaven, and impressions on rocks are shown, said to be footprints, made when they ascended. According to Babylonian mythology, Xisuthros was translated to heaven. The story of Elijah ascending to heaven in a chariot of fire may also be compared to the fiery, flame-red chariot of Ushas. This idea of some holy one ascending to heaven without dying was found in the ancient mythology of the Chinese. The story of David killing Goliath by throwing a stone and hitting him in the forehead may be compared to the story of Thor, the Scandinavian hero, throwing a hammer at Hrungnir and striking him in the forehead. We read in Numbers that Balaam's ass spoke to his master and reproved him. In ancient fables or stories in which animals play prominent parts, each creature is endowed with the power of speech. This idea was common in the whole of Western Asia and Egypt. It is found in various Egyptian and Chaldean stories. Homer has recorded that the horse of Achilles spoke to him. We have also a very wonderful story in that of Joshua's command to the sun. This story is related in the 10th chapter of the book of Joshua, and is to the effect that the Israelites, who were at battle with the Amorites, wished the day to be lengthened that they might continue their slaughter, whereupon Joshua said, Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou, moon, in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. And there was no day like that before it or after it. There are many stories similar to this, to be found among other nations of antiquity. We have, as an example, Tyet, which is related of Bacchus in the Orphic hymns, wherein it says that this god-man arrested the course of the sun and the moon. An Indian legend relates that the sun stood still to hear the pious ejaculations of Arjunan after the death of Krishna. A holy Buddhist by the name of Mithanga prevented the sun, at his command, from rising and bisected the moon. Arresting the course of the sun was a common thing among the disciples of Buddha. The Chinese also had a legend of the sun standing still, and a legend was found among the ancient Mexicans to the effect that one of their holy persons commanded the sun to stand still, which command was obeyed. We shall now endeavor to answer the question which must naturally arise in the minds of all who see, for the first time, the similarity in the legends of the Hebrews and those of other nations, namely, have the Hebrews copied from other nations, or have other nations copied from the Hebrews? To answer this question we shall, first, give a brief account or history of the Pentateuch and other books of the Old Testament from which we have taken legends, and show about what time they were written, and, second, show that other nations were possessed of these legends long before that time, and that the Jews copied from them. The Pentateuch is ascribed, in our modern translations, to Moses, and he is generally supposed to be the author. This is altogether erroneous, as Moses had nothing whatever to do with these 5 books. Bishop Colenso, speaking of this, says, the books of the Pentateuch are never ascribed to Moses in the inscriptions of Hebrew manuscripts, or in printed copies of the Hebrew Bible. Nor are they styled the books of Moses in the Septuagint or Vulgate, but only in our modern translations, after the example of many eminent fathers of the Church, who, with the exception of Jerome, and, perhaps, Origen, were, one and all of them, very little acquainted with the Hebrew language, and still less with its criticism. The author of the Religion of Israel, referring to this subject, says, "The Jews who lived after the Babylonish captivity, and the Christians following their examples, ascribed these books to Moses, and for many centuries the notion was cherished that he had really written them. But strict and impartial investigation has shown that this opinion must be given up, and that nothing in the whole law really comes from Moses himself except the 10 Commandments. And even these were not delivered by him in the same form as we find them now. If we still call these books by his name, it is only because the Israelites always thought of him as their first and greatest lawgiver, and the actual authors grouped all their narratives and laws around his figure, and associated them with his name. As we cannot go into an extended account and show how this is known, we will simply say that it is principally by internal evidence that these facts are ascertained. Now that we have seen that Moses did not write the books of the Pentateuch, our next endeavor will be to ascertain when they were written, and by whom. We can say that they were not written by any one person, nor were they written at the same time. We can trace 3 principal redactions of the Pentateuch, that is to say, the material was worked over and re-edited, with modifications and additions, by different people, at 3 distinct epochs. The 2 principal writers are generally known as the Jehovistic and the Elohistic. We have, in speaking of the Eden myth and the legend of the deluge, already alluded to this fact, and have illustrated how these writers' narratives conflict with each other. The Jehovistic writer is supposed to have been a prophet who, it would seem, was anxious to give Israel a history. He begins at Genesis 2:4 with a short account of the creation, and then he carries the story on regularly until the Israelites enter Canaan. It is to him that we are indebted for the charming pictures of the patriarchs. He took these from other writings or from the popular legends. About 725 B.C., the Israelites were conquered by Salmanassar, king of Assyria, and many of them were carried away captives. Their place was supplied by Assyrian colonists from Babylon, Persia, and other places. This fact is of the greatest importance, and should not be forgotten, as we find that the first of the 3 writers of the Pentateuch, spoken of above, wrote about this time, and the Israelites heard, from the colonists from Babylon, Persia, and other places, for the first time, many of the legends which this writer wove into the fabulous history which he wrote, especially the accounts of the creation and the deluge. The Pentateuch remained in this, its first form, until the year 620 BC. Then a certain priest of marked prophetic sympathies wrote a book of law which has come down to us in Deuteronomy 4:44-26 and 28. Here we find the demands which the Mosaic party at that day were making thrown into the form of laws. It was by King Josiah that this book was first introduced and proclaimed as authoritative. It was soon afterwards wove into the work of the first Pentateuchian writer, and at the same time a few new passages were added, some of which related to Joshua, the successor of Moses. At this period in Israel's history, Jehovah had become almost forgotten, and other gods had taken his place. The Mosaic party, so called, who worshipped Jehovah exclusively, were in the minority, but when King Amon, who was a worshipper of Moloch, died, and was succeeded by his son Josiah, a change immediately took place. This young prince, who was only 8 years old at the death of his father, the Mosaic party succeeded in winning over to their interests. In the year 621 BC, Josiah, now in the 18th year of his reign, began a thorough reformation which completely answered to the ideas of the Mosaic party. It was during this time that the second Pentateuchian writer wrote, and he makes Moses speak as the lawgiver. This writer was probably Hilkiah, who claimed to have found a book, written by Moses, in the temple, although it had only just been drawn up. The principal objections which were brought against the claims of Hilkiah, but which are not needed in the present age of inquiry, was that Sliaphan and Josiah read it off, not as if it were an old book, but as though it had been recently written. When any person who is acquainted, in the slightest degree, with language, must know that a man could not read off, at once, a book written 800 years before. The phraseology would necessarily be so altered by time as to render it comparatively unintelligible. We must now turn to the third Pentateuchian writer, whose writings were published 444 BC. At that time Ezra added to the work of his two predecessors a series of laws and narratives which had been drawn up by some of the priests in Babylon. This series of laws and narratives, which was written by some of the priests in Babylon, was called the Book of Origins. Ezra brought the book from Babylon to Jerusalem. He made some modifications in it and constituted it a code of law for Israel, dovetailing it into those parts of the Pentateuch which existed before. A few alterations and additions were subsequently made, but these are of minor importance, and we may fairly say that Ezra put the Pentateuch into the form in which we have it. These priestly passages are partly occupied with historical matter, comprising a very free account of things from the creation of the world to the arrival of Israel in Canaan. Everything is here presented from the priestly point of view. Some events, elsewhere recorded, are touched up in the priestly spirit and others are entirely invented. It was the belief of the Jews, asserted by the Perkaboth, one of the oldest books of the Talmud, as well as other Jewish records, that Ezra, acting in accordance with the divine commission, rewrote the Old Testament, the manuscripts of which were said to have been lost in the destruction of the first temple, when Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem. This we know could not have been the case. The fact that Ezra wrote, adding to, and taking from the already existing books of the Pentateuch, was probably the foundation for this tradition. The account of it is to be found in the apocryphal book of Esdras, a book deemed authentic by the Greek Church. Dr. Knappert, speaking of this, says, "For many centuries, both the Christians and the Jews supposed that Ezra had brought together the sacred writings of his people, united them in one whole, and introduced them as a book given by the Spirit of God, a holy scripture." The only authority for this supposition was a very modern and altogether untrustworthy tradition. The historical and critical studies of our times have been emancipated from the influence of this tradition, and the most ancient statements with regard to the subject have been hunted up and compared together. These statements are, indeed, scanty and incomplete, and many a detail is still obscure, but the main facts have been completely ascertained. Before the Babylonish captivity, Israel had no sacred writings. There were certain laws, prophetic writings, and a few historical books, but no one had ever thought of ascribing binding and divine authority to these documents. Ezra brought the priestly law with him from Babylon, altering it and amalgamating it with the narratives and laws already in existence, and thus produced the Pentateuch in pretty much the same form as we still have it. Tleesbu CS got the name of the Law of Moses, or simply the Law. Ezra introduced them into Israel and gave them binding authority, and from that time forward they were considered divine. From the time of Ezra until the year 287 BC, when the Pentateuch was translated into Greek by order of Ptolemy Philadelphus, king of Egypt, these books evidently underwent some changes. This the writer quoted above admits, and saying, later still, a few more changes and additions were made, and so the Pentateuch grew into its present form. In answer to those who claim that the Pentateuch was written by one person, Bishop Colenso says, "It is certainly inconceivable that, if the Pentateuch be the production of one and the same hand throughout, it should contain such a number of glaring inconsistencies. No single author could have been guilty of such absurdities, but it is quite possible, and what was almost sure to happen in such a case, that, if the Pentateuch be the work of different authors in different ages, this fact should betray itself by the existence of contradictions in the narrative." Having ascertained the origin of the Pentateuch, or first 5 books of the Old Testament, it will be unnecessary to refer to the others here, as we have nothing to do with them in our investigations. Suffice it to say, then, that, in the earlier period after Ezra, none of the other books which already existed enjoyed the same authority as the Pentateuch. It is probable that Jeremiah made a collection of historical and prophetic books, songs, and letters from Persian kings, not to form a second collection, but for the purpose of saving them from being lost. The scribes of Jerusalem, followers of Ezra, who were known as the men of the great synagogue, were the collectors of the second and third divisions of the Old Testament. They collected together the historical and prophetic books, songs, etc., which were then in existence, and after altering many of them, they were added to the collection of sacred books. It must not be supposed that any fixed plan was pursued in this work, or that the idea was entertained from the first, that these hooks would one day stand on the same level with the Pentateuch. In the course of time, however, many of the Jews began to consider some of these books as sacred. The Alexandrian Jews adopted books into the canon which those of Jerusalem did not, and this difference of opinion lasted for a long time, even till the 2nd century after Christ. It was not until this time that all the books of the Old Testament acquired divine authority. It is not known, however, just when the canon of the Old Testament was closed. The time and manner in which it was done is altogether obscure. Jewish tradition indicates that the full canonicity of several books was not free from doubt till the time of the famous Rabbi Akiba, who flourished about the beginning of the 2nd century after Christ. After giving a history of the books of the Old Testament, the author of the Religion of Israel, whom we have followed in this investigation, says, "The great majority of the writers of the Old Testament had no other source of information about the past history of Israel than simple tradition. Indeed, it could not have been otherwise, for in primitive times no one used to record anything in writing, and the only way of preserving a knowledge of the past was to hand it down by word of mouth. The father told the son what his elders had told him, and the son handed it on to the next generation. Not only did the historian of Israel draw from tradition with perfect freedom, and write down without hesitation anything they heard and what was current in the mouths of the people, but they did not shrink from modifying their representation of the past, and it is difficult for us to look at things from this point of view, because our ideas of historical good faith are so utterly different. When we write history, we know that we ought to be guided solely by a desire to represent facts exactly as they really happened. All that we are concerned with is reality. We want to make the old times live again, and we take all possible pains not to remodel the past from the point of view of today. All we want to know is what happened, and how men lived, thought, and worked high those days. The Israelites had a very different notion of the nature of historical composition. When a prophet or a priest related something about bygone times, his object was not to convey knowledge about those times. On the contrary, he used history merely as a vehicle for the conveyance of instruction and exhortation. Not only did he confine his narrative to such matters as he thought would serve his purpose, but he never hesitated to modify what he knew of the past, and he did not think twice about touching it up from his own imagination, simply that it might be more conducive to, i.e., end he had in view and chime in better with his opinions. All the past became colored through and through with the tinge of his own mind. Our own notions of honor and good faith would never permit all this. But we must not measure ancient writers by our own standard. They considered that they were acting quite within their rights and in strict accordance with duty and conscience. It will be noticed that, in our investigations on the authority of the Pentateuch, we have followed, principally, Dr. Quapert's ideas as set forth in the Religion of Israel. This we have done because we could not go into an extended investigation, and because his words are very expressive and just to the point. To those who may think that his ideas are not the same as those entertained by other biblical scholars of the present day, we subjoin, in a note below, a list of works to which they are referred. We shall now, after giving a brief history of the Pentateuch, refer to the legends of which we have been treating, and endeavor to show from whence the Hebrews borrowed them. The first of these is the creation and fall of man. Egypt, the country out of which the Israelites came, had no story of the creation and fall of man, such as we have found among the Hebrews. They therefore could not have learned it from them. The Chaldeans, however, as we saw in our first chapter, had this legend, and it is from them that the Hebrews borrowed it. The account which we have given of the Chaldean story of the creation and fall of man was taken, as we stated, from the writings of Berosus, the Chaldean historian, who lived in the time of Alexander the Great, and as the Jews were acquainted with the story some centuries earlier than this, his works did not prove that these traditions were in Babylonia before the Jewish captivity, and could not afford testimony in favor of the statement that the Jews borrowed this legend from the Babylonians. At that time, it was left for Mr. George Smith, of the British Museum, to establish, without a doubt, the fact that this legend was known to the Babylonians at least 2,000 years or the time assigned for the birth of Jesus. The cuneiform inscriptions discovered by him, while on an expedition to Assyria, organized by the London Daily Telegraph, was the means of doing this, and although by far the greatest number of these tablets belong to the age of Assurbanipal, who reigned over Assyria b.C. 670, it is acknowledged on all hands that these tablets are not the originals, but are only copies from earlier texts. The Assyrians acknowledged themselves that this literature was borrowed from Babylonian sources, and of course it is to Babylonia we have to look to ascertain the approximate dates of the original documents. Mr. Smith then shows, from fragments of the cuneiform account of the creation and fall which have been discovered, that, in the period from BC 2000 to 1500, the Babylonians believed in a story similar to that in Genesis. It is probable, however, says Mr. Smith, that this legend existed as traditions in the country long before it was committed to writing, and some of these traditions exhibited great difference in details, saying that they had passed through many changes. Professor James Ferguson, in his celebrated work on tree and serpent worship, says, the 2 chapters which refer to this, as indeed the whole of the first 8 of Genesis, are now generally admitted by scholars to be made up of fragments of earlier books or earlier traditions, belonging, properly speaking, to Mesopotamia rather than to Jewish history, the exact meaning of which the writers of the Pentateuch seem hardly to have appreciated when they transcribed them in the form in which they are now found. John Fiske says, the story of the serpent in Eden is an Aryan story in every particular. The notion of Satan as the author of evil appears only in the later books, composed after the Jews had come into close contact with Persian ideas. Professor John W. Draper says, in the old legends of dualism, the evil spirit was said to have sent a serpent to ruin paradise. These legends became known to the Jews during their Babylonian captivity. Professor Goldziher also shows, in his Mythology Among the Hebrews, that the story of the creation was borrowed by the Hebrews from the Babylonians. He also informs us that the notion of the Bor and Yoser, creator as an integral part of the idea of God, are first brought into use by the prophets of the captivity. Thus also the story of the Garden of Eden, as a supplement to the history of the creation, was written down at Babylon. Strange as it may appear, after the Genesis account, we may pass through the whole Pentateuch and other books of the Old Testament, clear to the end, and will find that the story of the Garden of Eden and fall of man is hardly alluded to, if at all. Lenkirk says, one single certain trace of the employment of the story of Adam's fall is entirely wanting in the Hebrew canon. Adam, Eve, the serpent, the woman's seduction of her husband, etc., are all images, to which the remaining words of the Israelites never again recur. This circumstance can only be explained by the fact that the first chapters of Genesis were not written until after the other portions had been written. It is worthy of notice that this story of the fall of man, upon which the whole orthodox scheme of a divine Savior or Redeemer is based, was not considered by the learned Israelites as fact. They simply looked upon it as a story which satisfied the ignorant, but which should be considered as allegory by the learned. Rabbi Maimonides, one of the most celebrated of the rabbis, says on this subject, we must not understand, or take in a literal sense, what is written in the book on the creation, nor form of it the same ideas which are participated by the generality of mankind. Otherwise our ancient sages would not ha so much recommended to us to hide the real meaning of it, and not to lift the allegorical veil, which covers the truth contained therein. When taken in its literal sense, the work gives the most absurd and most extravagant ideas of the deity. Whosoever should divine its true meaning ought to take great care in not divulging it. This is a maxim repeated to us by all our sages, principally concerning the understanding of the work of the 6 days. Philo, a Jewish writer contemporary with Jesus, held the same opinion of the character of the sacred books of the Hebrews. He has made 2 particular treatises, bearing the title of the Allegories, and he traces back to the allegorical sense the yew tree of life, the rivers of paradise, and the other fictions of the Genesis. Many of the early Christian fathers declared that, in the story of the creation and fall of man, there was but an allegorical fiction. Among these may be mentioned St. Augustine, who speaks of it in his City of God, and also Origen, who says, "What man of sense will agree with the statement that the first, second, and third days, in which the evening is named and the morning, were without sun, moon, and stars? What man has found such an idiot as to suppose that God planted trees in paradise like an husbandman? I believe that every must hold these things for images under which a hidden sense is concealed." Origen believed aright, as it is now almost universally admitted, that the stories of the Garden of Eden, the Elysian fields, the Garden of the Blessed, etc., which were the abode of the blessed, where grief and sorrow could not approach them, where plague and sickness could not touch them, were founded on allegory. These abodes of delight were far away in the west, where the sun goes down beyond the bounds of the earth. They were the golden islands sailing in a sea of blue, the burnished clouds floating in the pure ether. In a word, the Elysian fields are the clouds at eventide. The picture was suggested by the images drawn from the phenomena of sunset and twilight. Eating of the forbidden fruit was simply a figurative mode of expressing the performance of the act necessary to the perpetuation of the human race. The tree of knowledge was a phallic tree, and the fruit which grew upon it was phallic fruit. In regard to the story of the deluge, we have already seen that Egyptian records tell nothing of a cataclysmal deluge, and that the land was never visited by other than its annual beneficent overflow of the river Nile. Also, that the pharaoh Khufu Cheops was building his pyramid, according to Egyptian Chronicle, when the whole world was under the waters of a universal deluge, according to the Hebrew Chronicle. This is sufficient evidence that the Hebrews did not borrow the legend from the Egyptians. We have also seen, in the chapter that treated of this legend, that it corresponded in all the principal features with the Chaldean account. We shall now show that it was taken from this. Mr. Smith discovered, on the site of Nineveh, during the years 1873 and 74, cylinders belonging to the early Babylonian monarchy, which contained the legend of the flood, and which we gave in chapter 2. This was the foundation for the Hebrew legend, and they learned it at the time of the captivity. The myth of Deucalion, the Grecian hero, was also taken from the same source. The Greeks learned it from the Chaldeans. We read in Chambers' Encyclopedia that it was at one time extensively believed, even by intelligent scholars, that the myth of Deucalion was a corrupted tradition of the Noachian deluge, but this untenable opinion is now all but universally abandoned. This idea was abandoned after it was found that the Deucalion myth was older than the Hebrew. What was said in regard to the Eden story not being mentioned in other portions of the Old Testament save in Genesis also applies to this story of the deluge. Nowhere in the other books of the Old Testament is found any reference to this story, except in Isaiah, where the waters of Noah are mentioned, and in Ezekiel, where simply the name of Noah is mentioned. We stated in chapter 2 that some persons saw in this story an astronomical myth. Although not generally admitted, yet there are very strong reasons for believing this to be the case. According to the Chaldean account, which is the oldest one known, there were 7 persons saved in the ark. There were also 7 persons saved, according to some of the Hindu accounts. That this referred to the sun, moon, and 5 planets looks very probable. We have also seen that Noah was the 10th patriarch, and Xisthus was the 10th king. Now, according to the Babylonian table, their zodiac contained 10 gods called the 10 zodiac gods. They also believed that whenever all the planets met in the sign of Capricorn, the whole earth was overwhelmed with a deluge of water. The Hindus and other nations had a similar belief. It is well known that the Chaldeans were great astronomers. When Alexander the Great conquered the city of Babylon, the Chaldean priests boasted to the Greek philosophers, who followed his army, that they had continued their astronomical calculations through a period of more than 40,000 years. Although this statement cannot be credited, yet the great antiquity of Chaldea cannot be doubted, and its immediate connection with Hindustan, or Egypt, is abundantly proved by the little that is known concerning its religion, and by the few fragments that remain of its former grandeur. In regard to the story of the Tower of Babel, little need be said. This, as well as the story of the creation and fall of man, and the deluge, was borrowed from the Babylonians. It seems, says George Smith, from the indications in the inscriptions, that there happened in the interval between 2000 and 1850 BC a general collection of the development of the various traditions of the creation, flood, Tower of Babel, and other similar legends. These legends were, however, traditions before they were committed to writing, and were common in some form to all the country. The Tower of Babel, or the confusion of tongues, is nowhere alluded to in the Old Testament outside of Genesis, where the story is related. The next story in order is the trial of Abraham's faith. In this connection we have shown similar legends taken from Grecian mythology, which legends may have given the idea to the writer of the Hebrew story. It may appear strange that the Hebrews should have been acquainted with Grecian mythology, yet we know this was the case. The fact is accounted for in the following manner. Many of the Jews taken captive at the Edomite sack of Jerusalem were sold to the Grecians, who took them to their country. While there, they became acquainted with Grecian legends, and when they returned from the islands of the sea, as they called the western countries, they brought them to Jerusalem. This legend, as we stated in the chapter which treated of it, was written at the time when the Mosaic party in Israel were endeavoring to abolish human sacrifices and other abominations, and the author of the story invented it to make it appear that the Lord had abolished them in the time of Abraham. The earliest Targum knows nothing about the legend, showing that the story was not in the Pentateuch at the time this Targum was written. We have also seen that a story written by Sanchoniathon of one Saturn, whom the Phoenicians called Israel, bore a resemblance to the Hebrew legend of Abraham. Now, Count de Volney tells us that a similar tradition prevailed among the Chaldeans, and that they had the history of one Zerban, which means rich in gold, that corresponded in many respects with the history of Abraham. It may, then, have been from the Chaldean story that the Hebrew fable writer got his idea. The next legend which we examined was that of Jacob's vision of the ladder. We claimed that it probably referred to the doctrine of the transmigration of souls from one body into another, and also gave the apparent reason for the invention of the story. The next story was the Exodus from Egypt, and passage through the Red Sea, in which we showed, from Egyptian history, that the Israelites were turned out of the country on account of their uncleanness, and that the wonderful exploits recorded of Moses were simply copies of legends related of the sun god Bacchus. These legends came from the islands of the sea, and came in very handy for the Hebrew fable writers. They saved them the trouble of inventing. We now come to the story relating to the receiving of the 10 Commandments by Moses from the Lord, on the top of a mountain, mid thunders and lightnings. All that is likely to be historical in this account is that Moses assembled, not, indeed, the whole of the people, but the heads of the tribes, and gave them the code which he had prepared. The marvelous portion of the story was evidently copied from that related of the lawgiver Zoroaster by the Persians, and the idea that there were 2 tables of stone with the law written thereon was evidently taken from the story of Bacchus, the lawgiver, who had his laws written on 2 tables of stone. The next legend treated was that of Samson and his exploits. Those who, like the learned of the last century, maintain that the pagans copied from the Hebrews, may say that Samson was the model of all their similar stories, but now that our ideas concerning antiquity are enlarged, and when we know that Hercules is well known to have been the god Sol, whose allegorical history was spread among many nations long before the Hebrews were ever heard of, we are authorized to believe and to say that some Jewish mythologist, for what else are there so-called historians, composed the anecdote of Samson, by partly disfiguring the popular traditions of the Greeks, Phoenicians, and Chaldeans, and claiming that hero for his own nation. The Babylonian story of Izdubar, the lion killer, who wandered to the regions of the blessed, who crossed a great waste of land, the desert of Libya, according to the Grecian mythos, and arrived at a region where splendid trees were laden with jewels, is probably the foundation for the Hercules and other corresponding myths. This conclusion is drawn from the fact that, although the story of Hercules was known in the island of Thasus by the Phoenician colony settled there 5 centuries before he was known in Greece, yet its antiquity among the Babylonians antedates that. The age of the legends of Izdubar among the Babylonians cannot be placed with certainty, yet the cuneiform inscriptions relating to this hero, which have been found, may be placed at about 2,000 years BCA, as these stories were traditions, says Mr. Smith, the discoverer of the cylinders, before they were committed to writing. Their antiquity as tradition is probably much greater than that. With these legends before them, the Jewish priests in Babylon had no difficulty in arranging the story of Samson and adding it to their already fabulous history. As the Rev. Dr. Isaac M. Wise remarks, and speaking of the ancient Hebrews, they adopted forms, terms, ideas, and myths of all nations with whom they came in contact, and, like the Greeks, in their way, cast them all in a peculiar Jewish religious mold. We have seen, in the chapter which treats of this legend, that it is recorded in the book of Judges. This book was not written till after the first set of Israelites had been carried into captivity, and perhaps still later. After this we have Jonah swallowed by a big fish, which is the last legend treated. We saw that it was a solar myth, known to many nations of antiquity. The writer of the book, whoever he may have been, lived in the 5th century before Christ, after the Jews had become acquainted and had mixed with other nations. The writer of this wholly fictitious story, taking the prophet Jonah, who was evidently an historical personage, for his hero, was perhaps intending to show the loving-kindness of Jehovah. We have now examined all the principal Old Testament legends, and, after what has been seen, we think that no impartial person can still consider them historical facts. That so great a number of educated persons still do so seems astonishing, in our way of thinking. They have repudiated Greek and Roman mythology with disdain. Why then admit with respect the mythology of the Jews? Ought the miracles of Jehovah to impress us more than those of Jupiter? We think not. They should all be looked upon as relics of the past. That Christian writers are beginning to be aroused to the idea that another tack should be taken, different from the old, is very evident. This is clearly seen by the words of Professor Richard A. Armstrong, the translator of Dr. Knappert's Religion of Israel into English. In the preface of this work, he says, "It appears to me to be profoundly important that the youthful English mind should be faithfully and accurately informed of the results of modern research into the early development of the Israelitish religion. Deplorable and irreparable mischief will be done to the generation now passing into manhood and womanhood if their educators leave them ignorant or loosely informed on these topics, for they will then be rudely awakened by the enemies of Christianity from a blind and unreasoning faith in the supernatural inspiration of the Scriptures. And being suddenly and bluntly made aware that Abraham, Moses, David, and the rest did not say, do, or write what has been ascribed to them, they will fling away all care for the venerable religion of Israel and all hope that it can nourish their own religious life. How much happier will those of our children and young people be who learn what is now known of the actual origin of the Pentateuch and the writings, from the same lips which have taught them that the prophets indeed prepared the way for Jesus, and that God is indeed our Heavenly Father. For these will, without difficulty, perceive that God's love is none the feebler and that the Bible is no less precious, because Moses knew nothing of the Levitical legislation, or because it was not the warrior monarch on his semi-barbaric throne, but some far later son of Israel, who breathed forth the immortal hymn of faith, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." For the benefit of those who may think that the evidence of plagiarism on the part of the Hebrew writers has not been sufficiently substantiated, we will quote a few words from Professor Max Miller, who is one of the best English authorities on this subject that can be produced. And speaking of this, he says, "The opinion that the pagan religions were mere corruptions of the religion of the Old Testament, once supported by men of high authority and great learning, is now as completely surrendered as the attempts of explaining Greek and Latin as the corruptions of Hebrew." Again, he says, "As soon as the ancient language and religion of India became known in Europe, it was asserted that Sanskrit, like all other languages, was to be derived from Hebrew, and the ancient religion of the Brahmins from the Old Testament. There was at that time an enthusiasm among Oriental scholars, particularly at Calcutta, and an interest for Oriental antiquities in the public at huge, of which we, in these days of apathy for Eastern literature, can hardly form an adequate idea. Everybody wished to be first in the field, and to bring to light some of the treasures which were supposed to be hidden in the sacred literature of the Brahmins. No doubt the temptation was great. No one could look down for a moment into the rich mine of religious and mythological lore that was suddenly opened before the eyes of scholars and theologians, without being struck by a host of similarities, not only in the language, but also in the ancient traditions of the Hindus, the Greeks, and the Romans. And if at that time the Greeks and Romans were still supposed to have borrowed their language and their religion from Jewish quarters, the same conclusion could hardly be avoided with regard to the language and the religion of the Brahmins of India. The student of pagan religion as well as Christian missionaries were bent on discovering more striking and more startling coincidences, in order to use them in confirmation of their favorite theory that some rays of a primeval revelation, or some reflection of the Jewish religion, had reacted the uttermost ends of the world. The result of all this is summed up by Professor Miller as follows: "It was the fate of all pioneers, not only to be left behind in the assault which they had planned, but to find that many of their approaches were made in a fake direction, and had to be abandoned." Before closing this chapter, we shall say a few words on the religion of Israel. It is supposed by many, in fact, we have heard it asserted by those who should know better, that the Israelites were always monotheists, that they worshipped one God only, Jehovah. This is altogether erroneous. They were not different from their neighbors, the heathen, so-called, in regard to their religion. In the first place, we know that they revered and worshipped a bull, called Apis, just as the ancient Egyptians did. They worshipped the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the host of heaven. They worshipped fire, and kept it burning on an altar, just as the Persians and other nations. They worshipped stones, revered an oak tree, and bowed down to images. They worshipped a queen of heaven called the goddess Astarte or Melita, and burned incense to her. They worshipped Baal, Moloch, and Chemosh and offered up human sacrifices to them, after which in some instances they ate the victim. It was during the captivity that idolatry ceased among the Israelites. The Babylonian captivity is clearly referred to in the book of Deuteronomy as the close of Israel's idolatry. There is reason to believe that the real genius of the people was first called into full exercise and put on its career of development at this time, that Babylon was a forcing nursery, not a prison cell, creating instead of stifling a nation. The astonishing outburst of intellectual and moral energy that accompanied the return from the Babylonish captivity attests the spiritual activity of that mysterious and momentous time. As Professor Goldziher says, the intellect of Babylon and Assyria exerted a more than passing influence on that of the Hebrews, not merely touching it, but entering deep into it, and leaving its own impression upon it. This impression we have already partly seen in the legends which they borrowed, and it may also be seen in the religious ideas which they imbibed. The Assyrian colonies which came and occupied the land of the tribes of Israel filled the kingdom of Samaria with the dogma of the Magi, which very soon penetrated into the kingdom of Judah. Afterward, Jerusalem being subjugated, the defenseless country was entered by persons of different nationalities, who introduced their opinions, and in this way, the religion of Israel was doubly mutilated. Besides, the priests and great men, who were transported to Babylon, were educated in the sciences of the Chaldeans, and imbibed, during a residence of 50 years, nearly the whole of their theology. It was not until this time that the dogmas of the hostile genius, the angels Michael, Uriel, Yar, Nisan, etc., the rebel angels, the battle in heaven, the immortality of the soul, and the resurrection, were introduced and naturalized among the Jews.